In 1845, the British Empire launched one of the most ambitious expeditions in its history. 2 ships, 129 men, years of supplies, the confidence of a global superpower. Their mission was to do what explorers had failed to do for centuries: force a passage through the Arctic and complete the map of the Northwest Passage. Instead, they vanished. No triumphant return, no rescue, almost no survivors. Just a handful of graves, one desperate note, scattered relics across the ice, and a mystery that haunted the Victorian world for generations. How could a mission this well prepared disappear so completely? And what does the evidence now tell us about the final fate of Sir John Franklin and the men who sailed into the Arctic aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror? This is the story of the Franklin expedition, not just how it was lost, but how history slowly learned what happened after the ice closed around it. By the mid-19th century, the Arctic was one of the last great blank spaces on the map. European powers had long dreamed of the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the top of North America that promised prestige, commercial advantage, and the satisfaction of conquering a problem that had defeated generations. For Britain, this was about more than navigation. It was about identity. The Royal Navy had helped build an empire that stretched around the world. British ships had crossed oceans, defeated rivals, and charted coasts on nearly every continent. The Arctic seemed like the next great test of discipline, engineering, and national will. So, in 1845, the Admiralty sent out an expedition designed to succeed where others had failed. Its commander was Sir John Franklin, a respected naval officer with polar experience, though already nearing 60, and not the obvious choice for such a punishing mission. He would sail with 2 bomb vessels built for strength, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Their hulls were reinforced, their engines had been adapted for auxiliary steam power. Their holds were packed with preserved food, equipment, and supplies meant to sustain the expedition for years. On paper, this was not a desperate gamble. It looked like a model of British planning. The ships were strong, the men were trained, the provisions were immense. The mission carried with it the quiet assumption that nature, however difficult, could be mastered by preparation and determination. That assumption would prove fatal. When the expedition departed, it did so with ceremony, expectation, and confidence. Families said goodbye. Naval officers watched the ships leave harbour. Newspapers followed the mission with interest. Franklin's voyage was not imagined as a tragedy. It was imagined as a milestone. At first, the expedition proceeded in familiar fashion, moving northward into colder and less forgiving waters. The men entered a world of fog, stone, ice, and long silence. Seasons mattered differently here. Time itself seemed to change in the Arctic. Summer opened brief routes, winter sealed them shut. The Arctic was not just cold, it was structurally hostile to error. Ice could close where water had seemed open. Ships could be trapped not for days, but for entire seasons. Food, fuel, morale, and health all depended on surviving long periods of immobility. The expedition wintered at Beechey Island in 1845 to 1846. Later searchers would find the graves of 3 crew members there: John Torrington, William Braine, and John Hartnell. Those graves would become the first hard sign that the expedition had begun to suffer much earlier than anyone in Britain had hoped. At the time, though, no one in London knew that. From afar, silence could still be mistaken for progress. As the years passed, the lack of news became harder to ignore. Expeditions in remote waters often vanished from public view for long stretches, but Franklin's mission had been expected to reappear. Instead, there was nothing. For families, the silence became torment. For the Admiralty, it became embarrassment, and then alarm. Search missions were proposed, launched, and expanded. What had begun as a confident national project slowly transformed into one of the largest search efforts in Arctic history. And yet, the Arctic did not give up its answers easily. Searchers found traces, a camp here, relics there, reports from Inuit communities who had seen starving white men and heard of ships caught in the ice. But for years, British officials struggled to assemble these fragments into a coherent story. Part of the reason was simple. The disaster itself had unfolded across huge distances in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But part of the reason was cultural. Some of the most important evidence came from Inuit testimony, local knowledge that British searchers did not always value as they should have. That mattered, because while the Empire searched for certainty in official records and naval logic, the Arctic's human witnesses were already preserving crucial clues. The single most important written clue emerged in 1859 when searchers led by Francis McClintock found a note placed in a cairn at Victory Point on King William Island. The message is brief but devastating. Its first portion, written in May 1847, reported that the ships had wintered at Beechey Island and had been trapped in ice since September 1846. At that moment, the message still claimed that all was well. But a second message, added later in April 1848, transformed the entire story. By then, Sir John Franklin was dead. So were 23 others. The surviving 105 officers and men had abandoned the ships and planned to march south toward the Back River. That note changed everything. Now the expedition was no longer just missing. It had endured at least 2 winters locked in the Arctic. Its commander had died. The crews had eventually given up the ships that were supposed to be their best hope of survival. What followed was not exploration. It was retreat. And retreat in that environment meant something close to a death sentence. Why abandon Erebus and Terror at all? No single answer explains it, but the broad outlines are painfully clear. The ships had become trapped for far too long. The men were likely being worn down by cold, malnutrition, illness, and exhaustion. Scurvy may have weakened bodies already under immense strain. Starvation would have sharpened every decision into desperation. Later forensic studies raised questions about unusually high lead exposure, perhaps linked to the expedition's canned provisions or shipboard systems, though historians still debate how decisive that factor really was. It may have worsened the crisis. It did not create it by itself. The more likely truth is harsher and more complicated. The expedition was caught in an environment it could not master, under conditions its planning had underestimated. Each passing month reduced mobility, health, and options. At some point, staying aboard no longer looked like survival, so the survivors attempted the unthinkable, dragging boats, supplies, and their own failing bodies south across ice and land toward the distant hope of rescue. It is one of the grimmest decisions in exploration history. These were not men setting out with strength and optimism. They were almost certainly weakened, hungry, freezing, and operating under collapsing conditions. The land ahead was vast. Their route was punishing. Their supplies were limited by what they could carry or haul. Even the choice of what to take may reflect a tragic mixture of discipline, habit, and the inability to fully accept how desperate the situation had become. For many years, some of the clearest clues to the expedition's end came from Inuit testimony. Inuit witnesses described encounters with starving Europeans. They spoke of ships trapped or lost. They pointed to places where searchers later found artifacts, remains, or wreck-related evidence. Time and again, these accounts proved not incidental, but central. That is one of the most important truths in the Franklin story. The expedition did not disappear into a complete void. People in the region observed part of its final chapter. Their knowledge preserved facts that outside searchers would later confirm. This matters historically and morally. Too often, earlier retellings of Arctic exploration treated indigenous knowledge as secondary to European discovery. In reality, the eventual reconstruction of Franklin's fate depended heavily on testimony that British institutions were slow to recognize properly. The Arctic was not empty. It was a place with its own human knowledge systems, and those systems preserved part of the truth. The image that remains from the Franklin expedition is not of proud ships under sail, but of exhausted men pulling a heavy boat over frozen ground. One of the expedition's boats was later found on a sledge, loaded with supplies. It is the kind of detail that feels almost unbearable because it captures both discipline and futility at once. The men were still trying to think like a naval expedition. They were still trying to preserve tools, order, and means of survival. But the environment had already reduced the scale of their choices. They were not navigating toward triumph anymore. They were moving through collapse. Here, the documentary should resist the temptation to dramatize beyond the evidence. We do not know every conversation. We do not know each final decision. What we do know is enough. We know the ships were abandoned. We know the men headed south. We know that none of them made it home. And we know from later evidence that the end was catastrophic. That catastrophe was not only physical, it was symbolic. A mission launched in confidence had become a story of shrinking horizons, from imperial ambition to trapped ships, to scattered camps, to a handful of bodies and objects left in the Arctic silence. For more than a century and a half, Franklin's expedition remained partly unsolved. Historians could reconstruct the broad disaster, but the ships themselves, Erebus and Terror, remained lost. Then modern searches, informed in part by Inuit oral history and aided by new technology, changed the story again. In 2014, HMS Erebus was found. In 2016, HMS Terror was found. These discoveries were extraordinary, not because they created a dramatic new ending, but because they gave physical form back to a tragedy long known mostly through fragments. The wrecks, preserved in Arctic waters, allowed archaeologists to recover artifacts, confirm locations, and deepen our understanding of how the expedition ended. They also carried emotional force. These ships had once represented the certainty of a great naval power. Found again in darkness and cold, they instead looked like time capsules of defeat. The wrecks do not answer every question. They may never tell us exactly how each man died, how command decisions evolved in private, or what final hopes the crew clung to when retreat became inevitable. But they do something perhaps more important. They close the distance between myth and history. The Franklin expedition still fascinates people because it combines so many kinds of human drama at once. It is a mystery because so much had to be pieced together from clues. It is a survival story because the men endured conditions almost beyond imagination. It is an imperial story because the mission grew out of a culture that believed determination and engineering could master any frontier. And it is a tragedy, because the Arctic answered that confidence with indifference. In the end, the Franklin expedition was not lost because its men lacked courage. If anything, courage is one of the few things they clearly had in abundance. It was lost because courage was not enough. The ice did not care about rank, preparation, or national pride. The map did not yield simply because an empire expected it to. And history, when it finally reconstructed the story, did so not through a single grand revelation, but through graves, testimony, artifacts, science, and the wrecks of two ships resting in cold water. That may be the deepest lesson of the Franklin expedition. Not that exploration is foolish, not that ambition is always arrogance, but that nature has a way of exposing the limits of certainty, and that sometimes the stories which endure are the ones where human beings discovered those limits too late. The men of Erebus and Terra set out to complete a map. Instead, they became one of history's most haunting blank spaces,